Hello, beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me. And if you can hear me, we're going to look at a few questions that seem to have been left for us to get started with. Let me know if I am coming through. People are asking me about Duntsova. There's a couple of questions there. Hi, Sparkling Soda. There's a couple of questions there already on her, so we'll get there. I'm audible. So, okay, let's go and try to be patient and generous with stuff that was left there before. There's a question that's just come off in the YouTube comment outside this live about this live. Why do you say that Western democracy is going to? This comes in 3 times a day, this question, but let's have another crack. Why do you say that over the coming decades democracy will continue to decline in the West? Are you basing that on current trends? Really want to know why you can confidently predict the state of Western democracies more than 10 years into the future. And that's from what? And lots of letters after that name. So there is a cruel superficiality of everyday thought that can incline one into the idea that there's an ebb and flow of democracy and that you can only look 5-10 years ahead, not beyond. And that can make you feel like it's a neutral way of looking at the world, but it's not. It's a kind of subconscious submission to fake teleology. So what you really want to say is, what's the explanation? What are the series of explanations for the current trends? And are these the sorts of explanations that stick, or are they all explanations that twist over the course of a decade? So mechanisms of social untethering, mechanisms of exclusion, mechanisms of transformation and communication technologies, and on that list goes. Are these things are going to be things that can get fixed in a 5 to 10 year period, or are they not? And the answer is obviously not. Obviously, they're going to be at play 20 years from now. So that's how you can make sense of that as a trend. Exactly what form it's going to take isn't entirely determined, and how much we can make it better is also not entirely determined. So it's always worth trying to make a difference. But the idea that it could all reset and be fine is a profoundly cruel illusion that is a very direct threat in of itself to the sustenance of our democracies. So, kidney stones. How did the radical left become so dominant in our universities? I read that at least 90% of professors are very liberal. The news media is also becoming very liberal. Don't get confused between two distinct things. One is there something going on campuses that's a problem? And the other is the critique of it that you commonly encounter on the internet valid? Let's just say that what's going on campuses is a certain form of hyper identity politics, and the critique of it that you get online are the various modes of anti-wokeism. And recognizing that the first is a real problem doesn't lead you to recognize that the descriptions of the problem you typically get are fair. So just like to a certain limited extent, it might be true that the latest book by Yasha Monk about identity politics overstates how much it is a product of post-structuralism and postmodernism. I haven't read the book yet. It just has that ring to me. It's possible there is that mistake. Well, whatever is true about that, it's certain that the Jordan Peterson move of saying that hyper-identity politics is a in some non-trivial way, a manifestation of Marxism, I think that is a profound misdescription of what's going on. It's not just a misdescription, but it's even unhelpful to us as a clue for what the problem is. Why is it happening? Look, um, the the challenge here is to distinguish what academics think from what university bureaucracies do. We don't mind academics having different kinds of views, and we don't feel terribly worried, even if they all lean in one direction. What we're worried about is if university bureaucracies adopt a certain kind of narrative or a certain kind of ideology. That's what we want to avoid. Now, short of redescribing, because we've already talked about this many times, and I've promised a proper treatment of this, because most people in this community don't recognize that this is a problem. And I recognize that that's the case. And I recognize we've never had a full-on conversation dedicated to this. And we won't have that now, but we will have it in the future. What I'll say for now is that, short of describing what the phenomena is, cartoonishly, it is, of course, a kind of a deformation of the value that arises in the last quarter of 1,000 years in Europe, and that's the value of authenticity. It's a contemporary deformation of that value. But the explanatory stories that are going to take you in different directions. To some extent, it's a coping mechanism for certain failures of particular modes of capitalism. To some extent, it is a form of career competition between redundant elites. To some extent, it is a quasi-religious compensatory mechanism of various kinds. What I will say is that certainly in Britain, the majority of left-wing academics reject this, but most of them reject it in private. And they're scared to come out precisely because this has infected the bureaucracies themselves. They're worried for their career. So most academics in Britain who are very much concerned about social justice, concerned about issues of race too, concerned about the climate crisis, are scared to challenge the hyper-identity politics forms engagement with these issues often takes. But privately, the majority of left academics are against this phenomena, which is why it makes no sense at all to call it some kind of radical left. But is there a problem in that direction that is a serious one? Yes, there is. That shouldn't be denied. Ewan, we're going to be briefer now. Ewan, Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. Recent polling suggests this very strongly. How can this Scotland test this in a referendum if it's blocked by the UK? Look, only a minority of folks in the UK voted for Brexit. This is a difficult conversation because we don't want to go deep on Scottish independence today, I think. Let me just say two things that are very general, pull in opposite directions. Unless it's absolutely necessary, you want to keep people inside multi-ethnic, multinational structures unless they must leave. It's always better to keep that show on the road unless somebody's just got to get out. Part of the reason for this is split identities. That there are going to be hundreds of thousands of people who feel Scottish, but also with deep ties to other parts of the United Kingdom. But here we get into this story that people want to control their destiny, right? People want to control their destiny. One factor worth mentioning is what kind of a ship are you trying to jump on, this ship of the European Union? Is it a ship in good functioning order? Is it a ship that is in trouble? Is it a sinking ship? That also, of course, goes to the core of this conversation. Jasper is saying, just had a wisdom tooth out. Glad to see you'll be keeping me relaxed today. My questions about health, how to deal with medical procedures you find discomforting or anxiety or feel anxiety about. I don't feel anxiety about medical procedures on the whole, except in the sense that I might be reactive to certain medical interventions. And that's a big problem with people with myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is to say, if something goes wrong that's part of ME for you or something external, you don't want to end up in a situation where you have an extreme reaction to anesthetic, for example. That's always a problem. But the reason my answer is I don't feel anxiety is this. One of the leading people in the field of ME, who is my doctor, moved from HIV to ME in the 80s, really. And she began to meet these women and she ran tests on them and they looked profoundly ill on the tests. And she felt bad about telling them, oh, look, actually, there's a lot wrong with you, contrary to what your previous doctors may have told you, who might not have found anything wrong. And what surprised my doctor very much was that these women, and I say women because autoimmune conditions tilt more female than male typically, and whether ME is an autoimmune condition, it's categorized that way too. Most patients, 70% plus, are women. But these women were in tears about finally realizing, discovering that something is wrong, that maybe something can be done about it, if only something partial. So anytime doctors tell you that you've got something wrong, and anytime doctors tell you that we could try to do something about it, is an extraordinary liberation for many people with chronic illness, because they feel completely erased by the medical system normally. Platy is saying, Vlad, following your argument that our democracies must avoid making people feel excluded, can you give advice how the Baltic states should handle large Russian and pro-Putin parts of their population? I'll just be 30 seconds here. You've got to balance domestic political needs and stability with minimizing the chances of a Russian invasion. And these two things do not necessarily pull in the same direction. So you've got to balance an external threat versus various kinds of needs for domestic stability and domestic solidarity. Patrick, have you read anything about the topic of collective narcissism? I'm curious if the Kremlin strategically conditions and targets people's narcissism as a political strategy. The answer is yes, although they wouldn't think of it in these terms. But a profound sense of victimhood and resentment and unacknowledged greatness is something that, about which one might be resentful, is something the Kremlin has desperately tried to cultivate for a quarter of a century. Chayo is saying, due to time differences, I won't be here. But my question is, what do you think about Yekaterina Duntsova? So Duntsova is making some steps toward participation in the non-election that'll happen in Russia in a few months. Now, her obstacle, putting aside the authorities stopping her next obstacle is to gather 300,000 signatures across Russia. And the authorities can stop her before she tries that, while she tries that, after she tries it. Now, aside from the personal story of how much courage she is showing, this is an issue about politicization. The question is how much will her activation, however far it's allowed to go, um, be uh, uh, up to creating a modicum of politicization in the country? My answer is that we should be very skeptical indeed, because the room for any kind of collective organization, collective mobilization in Russia is very low. So we should be very skeptical, but um, politicization on that territory is in all of our interests. So we should welcome this, but we should be very skeptical about how far it can realistically go. Piotr is asking, can you comment on sense of humor in politics? So I and whether there is place for it in politics. So I am a big fan. And I think now we're caught up. Brilliant. So I'm going to start looking at your questions in a moment. Now, I think that what's absolutely terrifying me at the moment is how defensive politicians are. It's terrifying because you lose more that way rather than being confident and being assertive and trying to redefine how discourse goes. And so, because of that thought, there is an implication for humor. And that is that there is more room than politicians allow to reveal things about themselves that might have been very damaging to their careers only 20 years ago. And indeed to cast them in themselves in a certain kind of less than flattering light. As long as you do that confidently, the room for that is much, 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 much greater. So I'm talking about positive kinds of humor, not humor that is a form of a poison arrow you throw at your opponent. So let's have a look at questions that might be coming in. Hello, Bobby. Malfitano, you're in Florida. Zonko. I felt you misrepresented Harris and Dawkins. Their point is that it's only with the irrational belief in eternal paradise that whole groups of people can be persuaded to act in such violent, anti-democratic ways. Well, that's one of their points. And that's a point that they think can go far. And decent sociology of religion says it can't. Because you're going to have to explain the religious in non-religious terms. And one of the paradoxes here for Dawkins and Harris is that some of the explanatory weight that they're trying to excise here is unavailable to them if it is true that religion is false epistemically. Right? Because if there is no God, then religious experience is itself in need of a non-religious explanation on their terms. And then we're back to various types of destructiveness and various types of propensities to violence and predatory behavior that is part and parcel of human nature. And then that can be mediated by different cultural elaborations of it. Some will take religious forms, some not. So 75 steps down the line, you will struggle to give an account of how, without a belief in eternal paradise, humans are necessarily going to be enormously less destructive. But this is a really good question and a very important conversation, and it requires probably an hour on the Philosophy Channel to explore it. If you want good stuff on religious violence, read Charles Taylor. Neither Sam nor Richard are experts on the topic. The philosopher Charles Taylor is. I wouldn't put the likelihood of an assassination of Putin very high. Arseny is asking, can you comment on issues of identity in the Ukrainian war? On the one side, you have Russians saying there is no Ukraine. On the other, growing lack of tolerance for the Russian language. I think that what's happening in Russia is obviously very clear. What's happening in Ukraine is that the initial mobilization, cultural mobilization, that was part and parcel of resisting this imminent existential threat, that initial cultural mobilization can't be sustained because it was partly mythical. So what Ukraine is now going to have to engage in is a much more realistic and conflictual conversation about with itself about what it is, and that's incredibly difficult because you've got to do that in the middle of a war. But one motto here is the way to beat disgraceful, violent authoritarians is to be the opposite of them. That's the best way to beat Putin. But these are really tough asks to renormalize politics and discourse to some extent in the middle of an existential war. That wasn't necessary a year ago. It is now. And that's a tough ask for Ukraine, and Ukraine's going to need, all the support it can get with this. Zonko is asking where free will stands in a universe ruled by physical laws. There is a channel called Vlad Vexler Philosophy, and there is an episode on free will there. Blue Me is saying, how did you come to the belief there's a qualitative difference between time blindness of neurotypicals and time blindness of ADHD people? Well, secondarily through the literature, but primarily through lived experience, through observing people in my own life, people, several people actually close to me with ADHD and in some cases autism too. And I just think it's discriminatory even to say that it's a version of, it's a kind of a more intensified version of normal. I think it doesn't serve neurodiverse people very well, because the kind of time blindness that some neurodiverse people will feel will be legitimate enough for them to say, well, maybe I need some serious arrangements to accommodate this in the workplace. And that's different to me being sloppy with time. It's completely different to this. Pool, no song and dance tonight, but maybe something on the classical music channel when that channel gets going in 2024. Yes, general consensus is pointing out that Navalny has disappeared. I wouldn't put that into the red yet at the level of alerts. They love doing these kinds of things and then saying, "Oh, I know everything is normal," but we need to follow that story. The Odrid Vlad, what do you think about Russian public listening to Ukrainian speakers and then the other way around? It's hard. It's hard. In an ideal world, sure, Ukraine should engage with the Russian opposition, but in an ideal world, in reality, it's hard. It's hard. But an ideal answer is, yeah, both are looking. Both oppositional Russians and Ukrainians are looking at the politicization of the Russian space as something that's good, and so are we. But in practice, it is hard because, well, to some extent, there are serious questions to be asked of how clearly the Russian opposition see their role and what they're able to do constructively. And then there are serious questions to be asked about Ukraine's capacity to engage with the politicization of the Russian space. Um, it's not easy to do so, but so on both sides there are significant obstacles, which mean that they are not in a place where working together would be particularly helpful at the moment. But in principle, I like this. I like this engagement. I mean, I also understand unconditional hatred of all things Russian by Ukrainians. It's understandable to me. In those Ukrainians who feel that, and many Ukrainians do, some don't. Kaka Silva is asking me what do I think about the rise of the right wing. So um, the rise of the far right. So I think conservatism is normatively impeccable. I'm not a conservative, but if you want to see a conservative in the English-speaking world, look up Rory Stewart, for example. But I'm in love with conservatives. I'm just not one. But conservatives are normatively impeccable as far as democracy goes. Conservatives are committed to democratic institutions. What I'm worried about are fake conservatives, conservatives who have ceased to be conservative. Viktor Orban is not a conservative. He's a certain kind of revolutionary. Trump is a certain kind of revolutionary. Boris Johnson in the UK was a certain kind of revolutionary out to break the system. These are not conservatives, but they are dressed in conservative clothes. So there's a kind of a seepage going on where some conservatives are conservatives, but other conservatives are ceasing to be conservatives without the world noticing it, and sometimes without them themselves properly noticing it too. That's a problem. So the key distinction is, if we're talking about conservatives in a democracy, are you out to break the democratic game, in which case you're not a conservative, or are you not, in which case you might be? And then we might be on different sides of political issues or on different sides of the ideological spectrum or the same side of the ideological spectrum, depending on what your views are, but you're going to be on the same team as far as democratic institutions go. Is Netherlands as a democracy in danger? The universal pattern in Western democracies over the next couple of decades will be that the strength of institutions will keep our democracies going, even when anti-democratically minded politicians batter those institutions. The question is, how much resilience do we have in these institutions? And I think it's a kind of moral panic to say a year or two. I think it's typically much, much more. But it's also not the case that you can just batter these institutions limitlessly and still live in a democracy 30 years later. So the 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 stuff that's going to keep us relatively safe, democratically speaking, aren't going to be people. It's going to be institutions. The preponderance of political representatives is going to be more unconstructive, I'm afraid, than constructive as far as the sustenance of democracy goes. We can always change that to some extent, but the broad pattern will be there. And it's institutions that are going to keep the show on the road. So the way you judge this is, of course, you recognize what kind of intensity of anti-democratic force there is in each country, and then you look at the strength of the country's institutions. So, for example, if you look at Israel, Israel is a democracy inside the Green Line. Outside the Green Line, it's not a democracy at all, but it's a democracy inside the Green Line that has very few checks. In fact, has one big check. And if you try to get rid of that one big check, as the Netanyahu government tried to do, um, Israel's democracy is in significant peril. US democracy is much more complex and institutionally rich. You're going to have to break down many more filters, many more counter majoritarian institutions to smash it. So it can take much more damage. So that's one key question to ask. How many levels of institutional resilience does a particular country have? Um, Relative time works. Thank you so much for the helpful wishes. It's hard to see through the path of misinformation and propaganda. There is hope, but of course, the informational environment we are in is not conducive to democracy. But on a personal level, I'm a very big fan of being committed to putting more filters in place around what you put into your body unless it doesn't hurt you. So, for instance, I happen to not be negatively influenced by consuming trash online. Um, it doesn't go into me the way um, several packets of McDonald's fries would if I ate them. For most normal humans, consuming all of that stuff is like stuffing fries into yourself. You want to be careful. You don't want to have too many packs of fries per month, unless you really feel that that's not how you experience it. I don't mind that. It doesn't have a physical effect on me. Even if I read hate mail literally directed at me, it doesn't have an effect on me. Um, and this is, I'm not just saying this so that folks protect their mental health. I'm saying that it makes you a better citizen if you're resilient. When it comes to citizenship, we do have to take the oxygen mask in the airplane approach. Put it on you first, then think about others. You're not a good citizen if you're drowning in existential dread about what on earth has happened to your society and why on earth all this kind of stuff is coming at you. And it is difficult to deal with the radically disinhibited state of the internet, right? And the way we communicate with each other. We try to not do this too much in this community, but the way we communicate with each other generally online is utterly inconceivable um, in real life, right? I mean, how many times have you been vehemently abused in person in the last 6 months? For most of you, it'll be very, very few times, and for some, none. But online, for many of you, it'll be hundreds of times. Peter is saying, in my country, higher ups in defense are publicly stating that NATO might face a direct conflict with Russia in 3 years. I would guess 5. Thoughts on that early being a reasonable estimate? Um, I am not qualified to talk about that. Mark, I'm actually going to, on the community page, share a recent interview with Mark Galeotti where he was faced with this question and he's more qualified to answer this. All I can tell you is about Kremlin uh, uh, missionary zeal and Kremlin mysticism and Kremlin thinking. How that translates into practice, if at all, I can't tell you. It's just not my expertise. It's not my expertise to talk about the reconstitution of force in Russia and so on. So I do think that a story about a big conflict with the West is a primary story for where this regime is trying to take Russia. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be a direct conflict with NATO. In a certain sense, I discussed this on the in the very last video on the main channel, which is now called something like Putin wants to break up NATO in 2028 or whatever the title is now. So that intent is there. Um, the thought on our side that I would add is that it's not good enough to build greater defensive capability to take on Putin. We also need to take helpful steps toward reconfiguring the international order so that we have some vision of how the world needs to be. Otherwise, we'll permanently be in a situation where everything keeps going wrong. Now, it's a very hard ask, but we have to try. We have to recognize that the old, let's put this in quote marks, liberal international order has died. And we need some new thoughts here and new kinds of images that allow us to reimagine the international scene. The reason this is hard is because weak democracies in crisis cannot rethink the international order easily. But it's worth pushing for that. We don't just say defense, defense. We need a picture of what that defense fits into. How do we imagine the European space? What do we imagine in Russia and Belarus? What do we imagine? Right? It's important. How do we imagine principles of the international order as they apply to us too, so that we're not hypocritical about what we demand from what's around us? Spec is asking about Zelensky. I'm not an expert on Zelensky, and I'm not an expert on Ukraine's domestic politics, but there's a kind of evolution where Zelensky moves from an inauthentic and unreliable figure to a great war leader to now again having questions asked about his competence at home in Ukraine, questions asked about his capacity to have a vision for Ukraine that makes sense and take positive steps to it. And little by little, even a little bit, his capacity to deal with the situation Ukraine is in, which is that it's clearly looking like it's survived, but it's experienced a failed counteroffensive. And so, what's next? How do you negotiate this situation? How do you negotiate the situation of a long war? Zelensky has all the credit in the world for a short, victorious war, but he still needs a renegotiation with the Ukrainian citizenry about what his approach is to a long war with an uncertain outcome. So he is kind of still preponderantly in the realm of being a great war leader, but now with more questions being asked and with more exposure to those sides of him that were revealed before the war. So he's certainly partly transformed because he showed capacities he didn't show before. But nevertheless, you know, um, it, it's not going to be a smooth ride. So it's this three-stage evolution: the pre-war Zelensky, the war hero Zelensky, and the Zelensky who is now having to face more political questions at home. Miles is asking about my thoughts on the Trump verdict. Check the bookies. Trump is a strong favorite to beat Biden at the moment. And I think that vaguely tracks reality. But things can change in months and months in politics. That's a very, very long time. Am I saying that identity politics is the reason Western democracy is in decline? No. But once we elaborate a set of reasons, it'll be certainly in the top 10. Um, I've put it in around number 4 or 5 for several reasons, but one of them is the exclusion of the practitioners of that form of going on from being effective citizens, from actually being good at winning. There's other reasons too. But am I gonna say even though Jordan Peterson is wrong in how he captures the phenomena, is he right that it's the number one problem? No, he's neither right in how he captures it, nor is he right that it's the number one problem. For instance, in my opinion, as serious a problem as it is, the threat of the anti-democratic right is greater. And don't forget, you can't even untie these two things. Um, the hyper forms of identity politics we have now would just dissolve by themselves. But sadly, that's not what's happening. They're being met with a counter-revolutionary wave of a very authoritarian and anti-democratic kind. So no, and there are greater um, um, factors at the level of social forces and tethering our society in various ways involved too. So no, I don't put that near the very top. Yana is saying Jordan's number one problem is his own mental illness, but instead of facing it, he tries to tell her, look, I don't encourage anybody to be a Jordan fan, but I do think that of the admirable things about him, the way he deals with his autoimmune illness, which affects his brain chemistry in an absolutely terrifying way, is enormously humanly admirable. It's absolutely remarkable that he is able to function at all, given what he has to face on a kind of brain chemistry level. Now, having said this, the fact that Jordan is freaking out about being in the world existentially is not necessarily a feature you want in a leading public intellectual. There's a fascinating connection between Jordan freaking out existentially and the way he is so compulsively attractive to men today who are indeed living through what is not always for the right reasons, but is legitimately called a crisis of men. We do have a crisis of men under 50 in the Western world today. And there's so many culture warring elements to this that it's often not captured properly. Why can't the EU strong arm Viktor Orban? This is a series of dances, and it raises issues about the legitimacy of the EU if it can't enforce its own rules and values. Unfortunately, I believe that little by little, um, uh, there will be a sort of imperceptible erosion in the EU's capacity to enforce its own procedures. So that's how pessimistically I see the future of the European Union. I wish this erosion wasn't happening, but it is, I'm afraid. And that's going to be the pattern. So the EU's incapacity to deal more strongly with Orban is a sign of more problems and deeper problems of that kind to come, I'm afraid. Zonko, sorry if I missed your super chat. Cheryl is saying, I hear Ukrainians say that outward-facing Zelensky is very effective, inward-facing Zelensky is not. Yeah, I mean, Zelensky has cumulatively grown in an extraordinary way, but pre-war, he was despised by most Ukrainians. But that shouldn't erase the truth of the fact that he did become a great war leader, and that his early decisions, including his decisions to stick and not to go, were absolutely central, not just in the early stages of the war, but in the entire history of Ukraine's independence, I would say. What motivates Orban? Pula is asking. There are several politicians like this in Europe who are waiting for certain things to fall into shape. And they think that one way or another, that shape is inevitably going to come about, and it'll be accelerated by Trump victory in the United States and the Putin semi-victory in Ukraine. So they're waiting for that. They're waiting for a more emphatic dissolution of the old order. And then they want to take the stage. So it's a project that's still largely conceives of it's an international project that still largely conceives of itself as being in a waiting game dynamic until our democracies experience more fragmentation at home and more immobilization in our capacity to project power, which unfortunately is what has been demonstrated in the Middle East recently and is unfortunately being demonstrated in Ukraine. As much help as Ukraine has got, the limitations on that help are a demonstration of our lack of power in two respects, not just that we haven't done more, but in the sense that we haven't had a clear enough vision of what we need to do and how and why. we've been strategically floating, and these guys are waiting to pounce. Andrei is asking, how do Russians see Zelensky? Well, the anti-war Russians, of which there might be, let us say, 20 million, would see Zelensky as a normal guy and would sort of idolize him. The rest of Russians have sort of deranged and sickly conspiratorial views about him, or they just don't care and they're trying to look away. Rowan is asking, would the average person rather be desperate and unemployed in a collapsing social order under democracy, or living a productive, prosperous life under authoritarianism? So, of course, I believe that's a false choice. I don't think things get better, they get worse under authoritarianism. But are there a lot of people thinking in these terms today? Yes. And one of the worrying trends is that across US, Canada, Western European countries, younger generations are formulating this false uh, alternative for themselves and saying, well, maybe plan B will be better. This is a product not of a clear vision of anything, but of a lack of trust in the capacity of the institutions we do have today to deliver anything at all. It's a secret is asking, Vlad, you've often said that the US administration is committed to Ukrainian independence, but not a Ukrainian victory. What would a US commitment to Ukrainian victory look like? It would be a commitment that has a strategy, starts with a strategy for what is to happen on the East European space. It is a commitment that starts with a strategy that applies just as much to Russia as it does to Ukraine. So that means not just saying, what do we want to see on Ukrainian territory? For instance, it might be membership of NATO plus certain kinds of transparency of institutions and maybe the reacquisition of territory. What do we want to see on the Russian space? What are we going to work toward there? We can't take that space over. Russia is a nuclear power, but what do we want to see there? And the answer is we want to see a defeat of the authoritarian imperialist project on that space, on the Belarusian space. How are we working toward that? What's our Russia policy? So it would start with strategic thinking about that, and then it would, within the remit of balancing nuclear escalation and other forms of escalation, it would support Ukraine. But in recent months, what's been stopping us is a combination of a lack of strategic clarity and a lack of democratic capacity. If the United States were not in a political crisis, if the next election wasn't going to be between probably Donald Trump and Joe Biden, if there was more consensus and solidarity in US society, then the capacity of the US to project, if you like, benign imperial power into that part of the world stably and assertively would be much, much greater. And we wouldn't have necessarily created a situation in which Ukraine has to do a counteroffensive under conditions in which it's not clear how it would succeed. Sparkling soda is asking. I'll try to answer your question on Patreon. The trouble is, ethically, I think I'm not in a position to answer 2-page long questions just because I can answer 10 more in that space. But I'll have a go. But for now, I think that if it's a question about harm that's done to ADHD children in the medical system, let me say that I can comment on that as a public philosopher. I'm not an expert in ADHD. I'm obviously not. Um, I do not have any professional qualifications for this. However, do I consider it to be within my remit to talk about this? Yep, I do. So here goes. Um, um, the public discourse typically is one of overdiagnosis and over medicalization. And does some of that happen? Yes. The bigger story is a story of underdiagnosis, however. There's harm both ways, but the bigger harm goes in this direction. The bigger harm goes into underdiagnosis and into a situation where public health systems are not properly trained to deal with this. And you often get a situation where parents have to invest in private support to get their kids attended to properly. That public healthcare systems do not have the capacity to do this. Certainly on the NHS in the UK, if you've got a child with ADHD or with autism and you want support, the bottom line is realistically, you're just not going to get it. So I think the primary harm will be children who have these conditions not getting any support and not getting any interventions. But could there be some harm the other way around too? Potentially, yes. I think that's going on too. But the bigger issue is a lack of diagnosis of folks who actually, children who actually have the condition, and then a lack of support. Arison is saying, Vlad, why do so many activists on all sides move from trying to convince people to entertaining their supporters? Careerism, partly the gap between effective politics versus um, uh, aesthetic politics or expressive politics. So politics that's about conveying something to the world about you rather than changing the world. This is a very big problem on the internet because the internet invites you to please people who support you, right? So, I mean, just take this conversation alone. I roughly think that, I have a sense of we're a small group of 450 people. So I roughly have a sense of what you think. You don't all think the same thing, but I have a rough sense of how you all break down, sort of 70, 20, 10 different issues. I have a rough sense. I could sit here and just pander to that. How do I maximally please, you guys? And I have incentives for that. I mean, my biggest incentive would be to stop appearing regularly on the chat channel, discussing uncomfortable issues. My biggest incentive is to pump anti-Putin content here every day and on the main channel. Now, I don't do that. And indeed, I sometimes even offer content that touches on anti-Putin themes, but then elaborates them into other things we should be talking about, and so on. I'm highly incentivized to not do that in every possible way. So that's a problem. The reason I'm not going to be dragged by the current is to do with several reasons. One of them is that my intellectual life is off YouTube. So I don't think about issues for the benefit of making YouTube videos about them. I think about them anyway, and then we engage. Could talk about that much more. But what you're saying was already a problem 20 years ago. It's a much bigger problem online now. No, Rachel, you guys are not a hive mind, and this is it would be. I'm never gonna do it, but I know how to make a I know how to make a video that would maximally please this community. I'm obviously not gonna do it, um, but because of the fact that YouTube gives you various kinds of background analytics that I don't spend enough time looking at, I'm afraid. Maybe that's good news too. I have a sense of what 17 things large numbers among us here want to hear. And some of them are good things to hear, but not all of them are good. Some of them are reassuring sentimentalities that do not help us think in a way that protects us properly as citizens. Zonko, what does it mean for democracy in the medium term future when most intelligent beings in society will be non human? I think we need to postpone that. I think it's a serious question. I think it's a very important question. Rather than answering it or reframing it, I'm going to say this. I do not believe that AI is the number one existential threat to us this century, contrary to what some people believe. But I do think that this is a serious conversation. It's a serious conversation worth having, and I promise to have it. But it might be on the Small Philosophy channel. Jeff, thank you. Pool, sparkling. I've just got this sort of observations, perhaps worth making. The the people who most frequently appear on Twitter, for example, with assessments of the existential risks of AI are not very good at assessing other risks we face. So let me just be very blunt. I believe that at an existential level, risk from nuclear war is more immediately a concern for the remainder of this century than AI. We're more likely to be taken out by nuclear war than by AI before the century is out. It is how I would hedge it. Then, of course, there is climate, but I don't personally believe that climate is existential for human survival, although it's pretty existential and existential for democratic sustenance. I think democracies may well topple preponderantly because of climate related issues. But I don't see climate realistically as taking us out. That's not how things look. But nuclear war could, and I think it's much more likely than AI. But these are serious conversations worth having, and I promise to have them. Zonko is saying that seriously underestimates the impacts and risks of AI. Yes, a lot of people would say that. I don't. I think I underestimate them to a level that I think the risks are low. I don't think they're necessarily low at all. But existentially, I would put nuclear war much ahead at the moment. My advice is always assess the climate risk, assess the nuclear risk, assess the AI risk. Don't end up in a bubble where you've got people who are strong on one but really poor on the others. Um, assess risks of pandemics. Um, the trouble with a lot of these conversations, we operate in bubbles where people can't um, achieve a comparable sort of level of minimal competence across all of these. And then sometimes answers can be produced that just consider one of these but not the others. Let's begin gently winding down. Yoshi is asking, can a truly representative democracy exist in an age of social media manipulation and echo chambers? Well, truly means what? You might say that certain profound institutional dysfunctionality can bring it about that we say, understandably, well, this is no longer a democracy. We could also say about a society that it's a so-so democracy, or that it's a democracy that's flourishing. A perfect democracy isn't really a coherent concept, because the values that make a democracy what it is are in conflict. So um, e- even as a democracy flourishes, that flourishing itself entails various kinds of loss constitutively. So the idea of a perfect democracy or a truly complete democracy is an unavailable idea. But certainly what we've got at the moment is a crisis of people feeling that they can't touch the political process. And I do think that one of the factors driving this, one of 3 or 4 factors driving this, is the latest state of communications technologies, social media. And it's a problem. And as I've said earlier in this chat, I think what's keeping us on the road is the resilience of our democratic institutions. And that'll keep us going for a while, but we need more than just that. We can't rely on that, because eventually that'll snap. That can keep us in the game for 15 years, perhaps. Tommy, we might have a separate conversation about Benjamin. Tommy's asking me about the aestheticization of politics, as describing precisely our modern political crises. I feel that we're going to have to probably have a separate conversation about Benjamin at some point. Um, the decline of democracy that I'm talking about can be dated in various ways, but one way of doing it might be to go back to the 1970s, then with a very big acceleration more recently. But I promise that one way or another we'll end up coming back to this business of the aestheticization of politics. Fail Pit, how are you feeling today, Vlad? Um, I'd love to feel better, but I'm incredible at mm, engaging, even when physically I'm doing quite a lot of battle under the surface. Ferrari guy, let's make this the last question. Um, how much can you talk yourself down versus up? The Chinese Communist Party and the Russians only believe in talking themselves up. How self-destructive are we in our own sour views about ourselves? We can talk ourselves down mythically by talking about things that social complainers talk about. And that doesn't help, actually. Complaint doesn't help. But analysis of what's actually wrong helps. So Jordan Peterson saying that the radical left have taken everything over and it's all a nightmare is a complaint. It might be false, might be true to some extent. I've explained why I think as it stands it's false, even though there are some problems in that direction. But there's nothing constructive there, contrary to Jordan's own impetus to talk about, come on, you've got to do something, don't just moan. But that's a moan. And in a certain sense, there are continuities between that and a more sophisticated intellectual voice, Christopher Lash, which is still to some extent a voice of complaint rather than a voice of explanation. And I don't want to tease Peterson too much. Actually, I think he has very strong intellectual potential that's unrealized, but it is unrealized, I'm afraid. But there's a history of a kind of a culture of complaint among certain types of social criticism. That doesn't help. But what absolutely helps is to be objective about our democratic capacity. We do not want to say that our democracy can jump 7 feet up when it can jump 4.5. What we want to do is say, okay, it's 4.5 at the moment, so let's proceed that way. Let's know it's more than 3, but let's admit it's less than 5. So we do have to start with this objective, bracing way of facing our democratic capacity. We don't want to say that various economic and social forces pulling our societies apart. We don't want to say that various modes of exclusion in our society. We don't want to say that the state of the internet are just things that we can overcome via an application of moral willpower. That's not going to help us because these problems are systemic and we need real political solutions and imaginative political solutions, not fantasies about how we can think our way out of these things being true if only we think hard enough. No. So I do think that asking, are we sinking, which is the answer to that question is no, we're not sinking as democracies. But do we have holes? Yeah. Are we taking water on board? Yes. So all of that, I think we need to face. Otherwise, you're in a position where you have half a strategy toward Ukraine and you have no explanation of why we have half a strategy. If we just talked ourselves up, it'd remain a mystery to us why we only have half a strategy toward Ukraine. And we can't talk ourselves up into having a strategy toward Ukraine because that would require to some extent overcoming our democratic incapacities. And that's partly impossible anyway, and partly insofar as it is possible, it requires facing the world as it really is, not as we might wish it to be. And the same goes for facing the climate crisis and other issues. This is it. We've gone 1 hour and a quarter. So beautiful community. Obviously, awards your way for tolerating us going all over the place today, and also me telling you off a little bit here and there. But very grateful to you for being with me today, and sending you all my love. And I'm very grateful not so much for each of the conversations we have, but for the possibility of us to have an ongoing conversation in the healthful and transformational power of which I do believe. So, with gratitude and love, catch you soon.